Thank you very much, Will, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of B4E. I hope you had a productive day yesterday. The feedback I've had certainly suggests that you did. I hope you're feeling energetic and revitalized this morning because we have nothing less than the future of humankind in our hands over the next hour. So I hope you're going to take it seriously and focus your attention because somebody's got to do something. I've got a marvellous panel of experts who are grappling with these challenges on a daily basis, and I'll introduce them to you in just a moment. But let me just kick off by once again reiterating a few fairly stark facts and figures to sort of frame the challenge that we're talking about. Cities, large cities, occupy no more than about 2% of the Earth's landmass, and yet, as Will has just said, they generate, or at least we should say, of course, the people in them generate about 75% of global greenhouse gases, causing global warming and other things, as you know well. We passed the point about 5 years ago at which more than half of the global population lived in cities. And we're heading to a point around about the middle of this century where over 70% of people will live in cities. 93% of our largest global cities, as surveyed by the CDP, already recognise that they are at profound risk from the effects of climate change. And they frequently cite the increased incidence of major storms, of flooding, of drought, of drastic temperature change amongst the things that they are most worried about and indeed are already experiencing on a regular basis. These cities are alert and aware to the problem, and we'll hear more about that. So the challenge is nothing less than balancing exponential growth of our global cities with a very urgent challenge to drastically reduce carbon emissions generated within them. When I think about this in a UK context, I always go back, the thing that I like to draw people's attention to is a graph that was produced by the Committee on Climate Change, in fact back in 2008, where they began to get their head around what an 80% reduction by 2050 actually looked like. And people tend to focus on the end of that graph, where it rather dramatically drops like a sheer cliff down to that 80% reduction by 2050. The bit that fascinates me is that when you look at that point on the graph and you backcast over time to say, when were we last emitting carbon at that level, at that 80% reduced level, it takes you to 1850. So think about that. We're going to have people, in fact, we're going to have 3 times as many people in the UK aspiring to mid-21st century lifestyles and all that that means, but emitting carbon at the level that they were in the mid-19th century. If that weren't challenge enough, think about the built environment that makes up many of our existing cities. And think about here in the UK, the fact that we know that at least 80%, probably more than that, of the offices and the homes that we'll be living and working in 2050 are ones that we're already living and working in. So we have an extraordinary challenge. But cities have always evolved to meet people's changing needs and different lifestyles over time. But surely we've never seen such a profound change and challenge as the one we face now. That's what we're going to grapple with. Not only are we looking to mitigate the worst and most negative impacts, but we're actually looking to create cities that actually generate a positive impact, that actually make a positive contribution. So, as I say, plenty for us to get our teeth into, which is why I'm delighted I'm not sitting up here on my own, but I have a rather brilliant expert panel beside me. So let me introduce them to you. I will read some pretty succinct biographies of the people sitting next to me. Starting on my immediate right, Conor Riffle, who is head of the Carbon Disclosure Project Cities Programme. Conor oversees the growth of the Cities Programme for CDP globally. Prior to his role at CDP, he served in various roles at the William J. Clinton Foundation in New York, including Foreign Policy Fellow, and is a member of the team that developed and ran the 2nd annual Climate Global Initiative in 2006. At the Clinton Foundation, Conor was an early employee of the Clinton Climate Initiative, where he worked with large city governments around the world on greenhouse gas reduction projects. To Conor's right, we have Matthew Pencharz, who is the Environment and Political Advisor to the Mayor of London, GLA. Matthew first joined the Mayor's team at City Hall from the BBC in November 2009. He had previously spent more than 3 years on the network section of the BBC One politics show, where he focused primarily on environment and energy stories. These days, Matthew is a key member of the Mayor's team, serving as his political advisor for much of the first term. He was appointed Environment Advisor following the Mayor's re-election, and is grappling with these challenges as they face London on a daily basis. To Matthew's right, we have Terri Wills, who is the Director of Global Initiatives for the C40 in partnership with the Clinton Climate Initiative. Terri is the Director of Global Initiatives for the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group and is responsible for its networks, working groups of cities focused on common climate change and climate risk challenges and priorities around the world. Previously, Terri was the London City Director for C40, Clinton Climate Initiative, where she worked closely with the GLA on climate change programs. Terri has also worked for the Ontario government in Canada on a clean tech demonstration fund and was a head of strategy at the BBC. And finally, we have Gerhard Prätorius, who is head of coordination, CSR and sustainability at Volkswagen. Since 2006, Gerhard has been in charge of CSR and sustainability at the Volkswagen Group. He joined Volkswagen in 1992 as manager for environment and worked for the Volkswagen Group as a managing director for regional development agencies that dealt with technology transfer, especially in the fields of new transportation systems and environmental technologies. He also works as a lecturer in transportation policy and sustainable mobility, and he was appointed as an honorary professor at the Technical University of Braunschweig. So, welcome to all of my panelists. We have just under an hour for this discussion. What I want to do is in turn look to each of my colleagues here just for a couple of very short opening remarks. These are all people, as you can tell, who are grappling with these issues on a daily basis. What are the big issues that are foremost in your mind that we really need to be focusing our attention on? Conor, can I start with you?
Sure. So let me just be brief. I'll just say three things that are on my mind when I think about cities and climate change and the work that we do every day at CDP. The first thing is that I think we don't know enough about cities and climate change. Just the stat that was bandied about in the beginning, that cities are responsible for 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions, I think is a good start. But we don't really know enough about what that statistic really means. Is it really 70%? Is it a smaller amount? We just don't know enough yet about how cities contribute to greenhouse gas emissions worldwide and where the best intersection points are to help them reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. So the data we've collected through CDP, we've collected data from about 70 cities on their greenhouse gas emissions, and so far they're reporting about 1 billion tons worth of CO2, which is roughly the equivalent of the emissions of Canada and Brazil combined, or the overall emissions of Germany, just to give you a sense of sort of where the largest cities in the world fit. So that's one of the things on my mind. I think there's a lot more work to be done in terms of just understanding this issue. We can talk a little bit more about that. The second thing that's on my mind is that cities aren't waiting to figure out the global emissions contribution of cities. They're actually acting to reduce emissions right now, and we can hear a little bit more about that from the rest of the panel. But they're acting in a way that's helping them improve the quality of life and get richer in cities, and also enable businesses to locate in their city. So there are a number of co-benefits from reducing emissions that I think city governments are seizing, and the businesses in cities are seizing. And that's a very exciting story and something we can talk about more as well. And the last thing that's on my mind is just open data and the open data revolution that's happening around cities all around the world, something that we think about a lot and that we're doing everything we can to help to encourage. So there's a lot of work being done by cities to open up their data sets, and we're just beginning to see cities beginning to open up sustainability data sets as well. So there's a whole number of fascinating things that can be done around that, and that's something that's at the front of my mind right now.
Thank you, Conor. Matthew, what does this look like from a particularly London-centric point of view?
Yeah, just from a very London perspective, I think it's worth saying the astonishing demographic pressure that London is under. So since the mayor was first elected 5 years ago, something like between 400 and 600,000 extra people are now living in London. I don't think that's all due to the mayor. But this is a lot more than we had, a lot more than had been expected. And if you look at some of the projections that we'd made just 10 years ago, it was a lot less than that. And the census data that was published last year has revealed that we could have another million by 2020. So the target is to reduce our carbon emissions by 60% from a 1990 baseline by 2025 become all the more challenging. And especially when we consider how rapidly we need to develop in order to house these people and give them jobs and move them around. And electricity demand is already rising between 1% and 4% a year. And we can't not deliver that, because that means buildings aren't going to get built and jobs aren't going to be delivered and people aren't going to get moved around. So we really need to work out how to allow that extra electricity capacity, but at the same time reducing our carbon emissions. It's worth quickly giving a plug for the Mayor's 2020 vision, which is being published very shortly indeed. And this is a document which he hopes will get a broad consensus across political parties and civil society about what needs to be in train and what needs to be completed by 2020, both to face up this demographic challenge that we face, but also actually to grab the economic benefits and opportunities that, that they present. And I suppose the large thing is house building. We need to build about 50,000 new homes a year, and 500,000 by 2020. Obviously Crossrail is in train. The Northern Line extension, which is going to end at Battersea, which isn't that far away from here. But then also, you may have heard Crossrail 2, we've just started a consultation on that and where its line where it might go and how that might be funded. People have already touched on the built environment in London. 80% of our buildings are still going to be here in 50 years. We actually have pretty low energy prices compared to the rest of Europe in the United Kingdom. But because our buildings are so leaky, that's why they suck up so much energy and need to be retrofitted. And obviously we need a big investment in low carbon transport. And we do hope that the Mayor's announcement of an ultra low emission zone in central London by 2020, subject to feasibility studies by Transport for London, will really kickstart the ultra low emission vehicles market that at the moment hasn't had the pickup I think that we'd hoped for a few years ago. Just touch on the last point is that obviously at the moment politicians, and my boss is a politician, are utterly focused mainly on getting the economy going again at all. So I think it's very important that the agenda that we work in isn't in contradiction with economic growth. And in fact, the environmental and low carbon goods sector has been growing at around 4% a year all the way through this horrendous recession that we are now hopefully coming out of. And I think that shows the hope, the potential that this market provides. And that is how we need to, I suppose, sell it. And a few figures in London, I suppose, is it employs currently 160,000 people and is worth £27 billion a year. And in just a few years, it'll be employing 200,000. And I like to put it in perspective by saying that at the peak of the financial services boom, 5 years ago, that was employing 600,000 people in London. So it kind of shows you the size of this market and the economic potential. And that is sort of where we see it going and how we can deliver a low carbon future, but giving prosperity to our citizens.
Thank you very much. Terri, you have an altogether different perspective, looking globally, sharing some of the best lessons. How's it looking from where you're sitting?
Yeah, well, I mean, from our perspective, the world's megacities are really the front lines against the battle against climate change. I mean, if you look at the causes and effects of climate change, they're really focused on the world's largest cities around the world. You look at urban traffic, energy consumption, solid waste, those are the causes, but also the effects, so rising waters and drought. So there's a great need and pressing need for cities to act. But we believe that the potential for cities to impact upon climate change is tremendous. And one of the main reasons for that is that mayors around the world have tremendous powers. And they have powers over the most important sources of emissions. So if you think of building energy efficiency and transportation and even city planning, many mayors of the world's megacities have the powers to make a difference. And that's why we really focus on cities. And I think where we get really excited is that cities can not only act in isolation, but that they can learn a lot from each other. And a great example of this is our Climate Positive Development Program. And I think the name is very apt for the discussion we're having over the last couple of days. But this is really where we have 18 mixed-use projects around the world, so new development projects that are aiming to be net carbon negative. So in essence, climate positive. And these projects around the world are working with their host cities to really share the best practices that are learned by the private sector. So the private sector is working very closely with the city to say, okay, we're going to try some really innovative approaches and aim to be net carbon negative. And along the way, we're going to share what we've learned as innovators with this group of cities so that, what London may learn through their project can be transferred to San Francisco or to Seoul and vice versa. So we feel that, there's a lot that cities need to do, but there's a lot that cities can do do, and particularly working with the private sector on innovation, it offers tremendous opportunities. So we have a lot to be worried about, but a lot to be excited about as well.
Thank you. Gerhard, do you want to give us a perspective, looking at a particular sector, but also from another part of the world as well?
Thank you very much. Thank you also for inviting me to this conference with very ambitious issues. We heard a lot of the upcoming developments concerning more people in urban agglomeration and all these things. What will be the result? The result will be more transportation, more traffic than less. And therefore, we have to look for solutions. And we all know car industry is up to now part of the problem, but I think we have also to become more and more important part of the solution. And as far as I can see, we have solutions. We have solutions on the one side at a technical level. I think we will face a kind of structural change in the mobility systems. We will see their alternative drivetrain technologies, e-mobility. I think in the future term, e-mobility will be the most important drivetrain technology in the urban agglomerations. We will start with this. We have around the world ambitious programs. We have also setbacks, but I think this is quite normal. All in all, we have, for example, at the beginning of this week, an e-mobility summit in Germany, and we have set up ambitious goals. And I think we will reach these goals because the technology is now available. I think there's also starting a competition. You are facing some of the models of our competitors. I think we can do something a little bit better, but we will see what happens there. All in all, I think this will be the future e-mobility, but e-mobility only makes sense when we have the energy coming from renewable resources. And therefore, I think this is also a very challenging task to organize these cycles, not only at a technical level, but to organize this also at an organizational level, offering the financing prospects for the consumers, because all in all, I think we have some restrictions facing e-mobility to bring attractive packages to the customer. But there is also upcoming opportunity for not only car producers, but also for other business people, organize these concepts, organize financing concepts, organize charging infrastructure, organize intermodality. But to be honest, intermodality sometimes I read in the papers like a buzzword, because we have to face intermodality is already the reality. It is a reality for the highly mobile people, and I think these are 25% or something like this, and they are responsible for 80% or more of all these transportation in the world, and therefore intermodality is not the solution, one size fits all. I think it's sometimes like a buzzword, and therefore we have to face a reality. So from my point of view, first, technological opportunities are already existing, e-mobility in the midterm and long-term perspective, but starting now, plug-in hybrids, I think, is a very attractive alternative up to now, and we will offer in the next month and years a lot of different models. For example, we will start also as a Volkswagen group with now 4 e-cars, special e-cars, and there you can see we will try to bring an offering for the whole range of opportunities in this field. For example, specific city cars, small cars, but also offering our normal car, so to speak, the Golf Blue Emotion. And I think it's necessary to offering really the broad range of all these opportunities, because otherwise we will not have the acceptance of the customers, because we have to convince them there are up to now some restrictions with e-mobility. And therefore we have also to see what can happen with, call it bridge technologies or something like this. And from my point of view, it's only not the passenger transport which is really challenging. Most important is freight transportation in the urban agglomerations, especially when you see that the result, let's say, from e-commerce is not less traffic, it's much more traffic. The dispersion of all these traffics is, I think, possible to organize it with new technologies. I think there with commercial fleet management systems, at e-mobility, small cars, this could be a great opportunity. But to be honest, and close with his introductory remarks, moving forward needs energy, and therefore I think we have to be realistic. We will be at the end a consumer of energy and not a producer of energy.
Thank you very much. So as you would hope and expect, some very complimentary perspectives from our panel. I'm going to sort of kick off a discussion now with this panel. I've got a few questions of my own, but I'd like to sort of just get a sense of how many of you would like to ask questions and make a comment. Could you just give me an indication if you're storing up a question? Because I want to make sure that I allow enough time to bring folk in. Okay, all right, thank you. I'll come back to you in just a few minutes. I feel like being a bit of a dog with a bone about this issue, about the kind of the step change that we need to see. You know, I was chatting to Dax from WF a few minutes ago, and we were saying, you know, there is a bit of a habit. We kind of talk ourselves, you know, we went from stopping environmental damage and stopping climate change, you know, we moved on to sort of carbon neutrality and zero carbon, and, you know, now we're in the sphere of positive impacts, you know. There is a danger that we kid ourselves that we're actually making a big difference here, when in fact all the data, all the trends are going the wrong way. Cities, as I said, have evolved over time, they've met people's changing needs, but do we need to really change our mindset? You know, in a sense, it's all of our job to go and tell other people in the world that actually the outcomes could be great. There's a win-win to be had here. But is that convincing? Do we need actually a different kind of message? I mean, Matthew, can I pick on you? You're close to a mayor in a powerful position. Let me just add, is it a case of balancing kind of green and growth? Or is there a real political conviction in London to really harness green for growth?
Well, the first thing I'd say is don't be so pessimistic about cities. I mean, cities are actually very carbon efficient. If you have lots and lots of people living in a city, they actually use generally less, they consume less than they do if they don't live in a city. So urbanisation, yes, is a challenge, but actually when it comes to the challenge of climate change, it's probably broadly a good thing. As people get richer in a city, it's better than getting richer in smaller towns and villages and things. And in London, we are actually going the right way. You say it's going the wrong way. It might be going the wrong way on a sort of global scale, especially as China and India and the BRIC countries really get going and, I suppose, aspire to a lifestyle that we've had for, well, about 100 years or so. But I would say that London is going the right way because of the projects. You know, they have, like all these things, an exponential curve. It takes a while to get going, but our program's taking off. We have a public sector buildings retrofit program that has proven the point, and is now, the government is talking about expanding it to the rest of the UK. We hope that the Green Deal will deliver on the domestic buildings retrofit program. So I wouldn't be too much of a pessimist. But you're right in that we have, you know, democratically elected politicians have to govern with consent. And, you know, we can't do you know, there's some journalists who are such, I'm not going to name them, who I think would be sort of dictators about this and would just tell people to do things. Well, politicians don't work that way. And I think that certainly in London and in C40 cities that are Democrat, you know, like in New York or other, Toronto, well, not the current mayor, but previously in Toronto, they actually are leading on this agenda, but with the consent of the population. So we can't expect people to go live in teepees, I'm afraid. We have to accept the fact that people want to drive to work often. But in London, despite the huge increase in the population, actually car usage has remained flat and is dropping. When you think how quickly the population is growing, that's quite an achievement, in fact. So actually, I kind of, it's a lot of fierce nudging, I would say, rather than a more doctrinaire, you can't live the way you want to live or the way you used to live. And policymakers need to set a framework to make it easier. And I would say the GLA has had a history of actually delivering on that. And it's the cities of C40, and I should declare an interest because I'm actually on the board of C40, that wasn't in the biog, is helping to drive that agenda forward. So don't be too much a pessimist.
Thank you. Conor, I'd like to bring you in to build on that. I also want to throw at you something you emailed to me the other day where you said, provocatively, climate change is the best thing to happen to cities since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648.
This is true.
Elaborate.
All right, well, the first thing first, just to Matthew's point, I absolutely agree. And I think, just to be very clear, from our perspective, green equals growth. I mean, make no mistake in these cities. That as cities become greener, they are growing. It is leading to a better economy. It is growing jobs. It's leading to new businesses. It's helping cities to attract investment. You know, just think about how the efforts that London has made to improve transport in the city have helped you all in your quality of life. I mean, I came from East London to get here today, and it took me, you know, 40 minutes. It was not a long trip. I had many different options of different ways to come. I could have come by train. I could have come by tube. If I wanted, I could have gotten out and walked. So there's lots of different options, and London's efforts to do this are helping to lead to more quality of life. And to your point, Paul, that's one of the things that's going to help this issue to accelerate is as we see the connection between lowering emissions and improving quality of life, then the population gets behind it. You know, it's an amazing thing to live in a city these days, where if you remember 20 years ago what it was like to live in a city, it wasn't that great. But now it's amazing. It's great to live in a city. I mean, London is fantastic. And the greening of London and the fact that it's becoming a lower carbon place is a key part of that. So, I mean, to the piece of Westphalia, I do think, I mean, I think cities are using the opportunity of climate change to exert a sovereignty and improve their international relations and take a lead internationally. And governments, national governments, have not been doing that. And I think the C40 and the success of C40 is a great example of cities saying, this is an issue where we're going to lead because national governments aren't leading. And if you remember the Peace of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War from your history classes, you'll remember that that was really the beginning of the rise of the nation state. That was the time when city-states and cities began to lose power, and national governments really began to take power. And climate change in the last 10 years has suggested that actually cities can take a leadership role again. They're starting to bring some of that sovereignty back.
Thank you, Conor. I think you're absolutely right. I've certainly experienced an improvement in quality of life in London over the last few years, but that's not true of all cities around the world, right? I mean, Terri, how much are you seeing? What are the smartest cities sharing, and what about some of the younger cities around the world who are in their infancy grappling with these issues?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, their cities around the world are showing, I guess, what we call great practices or best practices in various different areas. But I think, you know, what we are seeing from so many of our cities is that they are really starting to quantify the wider benefits of some of these green policies, you could say. So we have a network focused on green growth. It's led by the city of Copenhagen, who's been really innovative in their approach to green growth. And what we're looking at within that network is cities are starting to identify you know, cost-benefit assessments of doing some of these really innovative green policies. So if you look at, you know, Tokyo has a very innovative cap-and-trade program for its buildings. They are exceeding expectations in terms of the emissions that have been reduced from the buildings that are falling under that cap-and-trade program. And what they're finding is that those buildings are, you know, they're seeing lower costs. They're more competitive in the property marketplace, right? So these cities are starting to quantify these things. Copenhagen has done a study on bicycling that really quantifies the cost-benefit analysis of cycling versus driving. And so major cities that are in emerging economies like Sao Paulo and even some of the cities in China are looking at some of these studies and saying, actually, if we were to implement some of this on a larger scale, it could be really exciting. So, you know, I think there are cities all around the world in the, you know, emerging economies as well as a developed world that are really seeing the direct benefits. I mean, one of those areas too is transportation and the link with air quality. I mean, cities in China and also cities like Bogota in Colombia are really saying, well, we have there's a huge opportunity to improve the health of our citizens by, you know, in Bogota's case, implementing a bus rapid transit system that has very clean technology buses. And the population is really supportive of those kinds of programs because they're able to walk out their door and say, I love that BRT system because I get to work faster, I spend less time commuting, but also the air is cleaner for me to breathe. And so, you know, that's where we see a huge opportunity is really quantifying those additional benefits that, oh yeah, by the way, also help to mitigate climate change.
Thank you, Terri. Gerhard, we're talking about fundamentally changing the impacts of our lives from negative to positive impacts. I mean, I wonder, and particularly in the area where you focused around mobility and so on, you know, can we achieve what we're setting out to do by clever choice editing, if you recognise that phrase, in terms of the choices that we give people, or are we talking about wholesale behaviour change? You know, how much have we got to take people with us, and how much can smart people design solutions that lead our lives to have more positive impacts?
Well, I think both is important. We have to make the choices for the people, because this is, I think, the most attractive ways that they can also change their behavior, because if you have no change, you can't change your behavior, and therefore it's so important. And we have a lot of opportunities in the urban agglomerations for different choices to go from A to B. But on the other side, we have a lot of traffic of transportation which is unavoidable. And for example, especially as I mentioned, there's the freight transport or the transport for pharmacies, delivering the pharmacies for care industries and all these things. And therefore, we will face a lot of transportation which will not have the opportunity to shift to other modes. So we have a tremendous number of individual mobility, and therefore we have to find out there's the best technological solutions and organizational solutions, as I mentioned earlier. But I don't want to shed some water in your wine glasses. I think we have a lot of great examples in all these cities, but we have also facing a lot of tremendous challenges with air quality in Beijing, in other Chinese cities, but also in Cairo and all these things. And I know one of the causes is individual mobility by internal combustion engines. But to give you a very pragmatic problem of our conflicts, all these customers, but also the politicians, the governments, expect that we will deliver the best available technologies, and we will do so, especially when you see the case in China. But we have to face there, for example, a tremendous lack in the quality of the fuels. And this is one of the reasons that we have there really tremendous air pollution in these fields. And therefore, there are some very pragmatic solutions necessary. We have to discuss great examples. We have to discuss all these things, but we have also to work at a very basic way to find solutions for these things. We offer the best technology, but where is the quality of the fuels, for example?
Okay, thank you, Gerhard. I'm going to come in just a second to your questions and bring you into this discussion. The last question for me is about leadership. It's one of those things that always comes up. This conference is called, is about business for the environment. Do we need the private sector to lead, or actually are cities one of those kind of special places where we do need people like mayors? Is there a special answer to this question in the case of cities? Conor, what's your thought?
Sure. So it'd be interesting to get Matthew's perspective on this as well. But from my point of view, I think you need both. You need to have leadership from cities and from businesses. But here's the great thing about cities, is that they provide the enabling environment to allow businesses to lead. So that's the key thing, and that's where I think you've seen so much great innovation from cities over the last decade, specifically around climate change and green, is cities providing the regulatory environments and providing the platform on which businesses can innovate. There's a great example of this right now in San Francisco, where you're beginning to see private sector companies offer public transit, or what is generally considered public transit. There's a company called RidePal, where basically if enough people via the web sign up and say, my commute is from this corner to this corner, and there's enough people there's enough demand for that commute route, RidePal will actually have a bus that then picks people up and takes them from that corner to the other corner. And RidePal now has these buses going all over San Francisco. So the city government has really helped to enable that to happen and enable the private sector to provide these different solutions to the citizens of the city. So I think you're seeing great leadership from both, but the city has that special sauce, which is that enabling factor, which is so critical in this area.
Is that how you see it, Matthew?
Yeah, there's not really much I can really add to Conor, but in that the city governments can set the policy framework and hopefully a business-friendly pointing to the green and low-carbon sector. And because no governments in the West have very much money. But what we can do, in fact, we don't have any money, but what we can do is set the policy framework to allow the private sector to come in and invest in new infrastructure or new systems that will deliver the low-carbon future that we need, but also, frankly, makes money and give us all the prosperity that we need. So, for example, the Mayor has set a target of 25% of London's energy to be generated locally by 2025. We reckon this will require something like £7 billion worth of investment. We haven't got that, but obviously the private sector does. And so what we are trying to do is by pulling policy levers that the Mayor can control, to stimulate that market, de-risking investment. So, for example, putting it in the planning system. So major developments would encourage an energy centre on site rather than just plugging into the electricity and gas grids. And we're applying for a junior electricity licence to allow effectively, if you have excess generation capacity, to sell that at a better rate than you would currently get through the big six. So these are sort of some of the policy levers that we're pulling to try and get the private sector to invest in the new infrastructure and systems that we need to deliver the future that we all want to see.
Okay, lots of nodding going on around here, so there's a danger of consensus and agreement breaking out, as ever. So I look for some challenging questions. There's a gentleman over there, there's a microphone heading your way in the time-honoured tradition. If you could just say who you are, where you're from, and I'll take a couple of questions and then pass it to the panel, and I'll go on like that. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. My name's Paul Toyne. I'm a London Sustainable Development Commissioner. And in the spirit of what you're asking, Paul, I want to put some challenge back to this group. So my first challenge is to Conor, who described London as becoming a lower carbon place, to quote. My challenge is, how do we really know that? Because actually, yes, we're driving down Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and we're doing a good job in London, so transport is a good example of that. However, really understanding the total carbon footprint and the consumption patterns that we have of our goods and services is critical to this, because the problems may be being created and polluted somewhere else. And that's an opportunity for you, Matthew, to talk about the work the Commission's done with the GLA and the PAS 2070, so if you can remember that. The second challenge I've got is around quality of life. Yeah. So can we just remind ourselves what happened 2 years ago in London, where we had riots on the streets in Tottenham and Croydon? We know what's going on in Stockholm at the moment. Quality of life issues relate back to social inequality. They relate back to issues like fuel poverty, affordable housing, and there is a place to play around the green agenda and low carbon homes. So I'd like some comments on that. And then the third thing, which really is a challenge back, because I do a lot of work with cities, and I think the biggest problem we've got at the moment is the inabilities of cities to do a multi-dimensional synthesis of the issues that are really affecting our cities, so they can deliver investments that deliver these co-benefits. A very good example of that is we've talked a lot about transportation, and we've talked about reducing pollution through moving away from fossil fuels to EVs. However, in London, one of our biggest causes of air quality or pollution is NOx and SOx, which comes from brake pads and various other things. So my challenge back is, how can cities better organise themselves to understand the governance, to do this analysis, so that we are actually not driving unintended consequences or just looking at a low carbon agenda rather than the bigger picture?
Thank you very much. You'll pass the microphone over to the lady at the front.
Thank you. I'm Elizabeth Block, a writer on renewables. I'm surprised that the burning question, as it were, of rubbish has not been mentioned. I believe that Britain is really lagging on waste to energy, and I would ask Terri in particular what the Clinton initiative might be recommending, and I'd like to know from Matthew what London is doing about some sort of anaerobic digestion, or there are many other processes.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, some good issues to get our teeth into there. Conor, do you want to kick off?
All right. Well, Paul, good to see you. I agree with you absolutely. I think in terms of the first question of how do we know London is reducing its emissions, well, I think we're seeing that because London is doing something that very few other cities are doing, which is it's measuring its carbon footprint of the entire community area of London within the M25 every year. So London is able to tell each year how much has it reduced, and that's very important. Most businesses measure their emissions every year, and cities increasingly are beginning to, but London has been doing it for years, and that's a great level of leadership. So that's a very important point for London. On consumption emissions, I absolutely agree. This is something that London is already looking at, and Matthew can talk to that. But Other cities are beginning to look at this issue as well. I think it's just very early days on the issue of consumption emissions. Cities for years have been working just to try to do just a scope 1 and 2 emissions footprint because it's very complicated for their city. So to now throw in consumption-based emissions is just another level of complexity that they have to manage. And I think cities will make decisions for themselves about whether or not consumption-based emissions are important enough for their city to measure. And I think London has decided that they are. Other cities may decide that they're not. So it's really up to the city. And then just one point on the riots, if I could, and before I turn it over, is just the power of economic growth there, and how we can see, the work on climate change can lead to more economic growth, and that's going to be a big help in solving some of the challenges that I think were brought up by the riots. Things like the Southeast London Combined Heat and Power Plant, which helped to provide good, highly skilled jobs in Southeast London, where I live, is a great example of how these types of investments in renewable energy and in low carbon energy can help to provide economic growth and jobs, which will eventually help to indirectly address the riots issue.
Thanks, Conor. Terri, can I ask you to come in maybe with some of your reflections? There was one question directed at you, but more broadly in terms of how you're seeing those things play out internationally.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I echo a lot of Conor's points about the Scope 3 emissions are important, but are very complicated. And I think a lot of cities are still getting their heads around how to measure and report on Scope 1 and 2. And London and a number of other cities will be working on Scope 3, and we're really excited to work with them on that. I think in terms of also the issue of riots and concerns about social inequality, we believe that a lot of green policies actually do help to achieve social equity and economic empowerment. I mean, if you look at even within London, the climate positive project that we have in London, Elephant and Castle, is going to see a huge regeneration of a previously really deprived area and a really not very positive design of that whole space. And what we're going to be seeing is new park space. It's going to be much more open. There's going to be new shops coming in. It's going to be a place where people from all across London are going to visit. And so we think that actually a green development is also one that can be economically empowering and support social equity and equality. In terms of the very specific question about waste, it's a very complicated one. It's a really good question. Waste to energy is complicated. There are benefits to waste to energy and challenges. I mean, we're seeing cities like Stockholm have been really advanced with waste to energy, but actually have to import the waste in order to have enough waste to create the energy. So it's not always as simple. What we look at is the waste hierarchy and really trying to reduce waste in the first place. And so a lot of our networks are focused on integrated waste management, so supporting cities as far-reaching as, for example, Lagos. We've done a lot of work in Lagos in Nigeria to look at how they first improve collection, how they can improve recycling, composting, how cities around the world can use the informal sector, so informal recyclers, to actually reuse waste and turn them into products. In some cases, it makes sense to use the waste for energy, but not in every situation. So we don't actually recommend a very specific approach, but we work with cities and technical partners to really share what they are working on and what is working best depending on their situation. And then we work to connect the cities which have similar situations. So cities which have an informal recycling sector will bring together. Cities which are focused on maybe landfill gas capture will bring together. Cities like Stockholm that want to import waste and create waste to energy will also bring them together. But there's no easy answer, but it's definitely an important issue to examine.
Thank you, Terri. Matthew, I love your views on rubbish, riots, and quality of life.
Okay, starting with rubbish. I'm going to talk from a very London perspective. Waste management in London is not easy because it is completely balkanised, the way it's organised. We're the strategic authority, the GLA, which the mayor heads. Underneath us are 33 local authorities. They are very jealous about the way they manage their waste. This is because central government over the last 30 years, 40 years, has taken away so much of local government's power. What's really left is the bins. It's the only service that everybody uses. And therefore, politicians win and lose elections on bins, which is why you often see in some of our newspapers a lot of sensational stories about waste management, I suppose, because it is something that does touch everybody, and it's the way politicians fight their elections. So it makes it quite challenging. But having said that, we are doing what we can, and in fact in London we reckon that even after diverting the most we can to reduce waste or recycle or reuse it or whatever, we could heat and power up to 260,000 homes from rubbish, which would do quite a lot for our carbon emissions, I have to say. So we are working with this. There is we have 2 large-scale incinerators in London at the moment. A third one is going through planning. I can't say anything more than that because it'll come to the mayor. In fact, I think it's coming to the mayor for his decision at some point coming up. When it comes to AD, there's a London Waste and Recycling Board, another one which I sit on as the mayor's nominee, and that has helps to crowd an investment in new waste infrastructure. And the first AD plant is being constructed at the moment, and there are several in planning as well. So we are doing these innovative technologies to use waste in a more sensible way than sticking a hole in the ground somewhere outside of London, which is becoming more and more financially impossible because of something called the landfill tax, which is a tax per tonne of waste put in the ground, and it's going up and up and up, and it's costing London, to council taxpayers, a great deal of money. So if it's diverted to recycling or incineration, that's obviously more efficient. Paul made some comments about unintended consequences. I think the best one of some environmental policy. So I suppose the best example on air quality is the drive to dieselisation that's been driven because of vehicle excise duty. Now this has made, so 50% of our cars now or so are diesels. This wasn't the case 10 years ago, and it's meant that the air quality challenge is becoming a lot harder than we had anticipated. So we have actually recently tightened the discount for the congestion charge. I'm afraid to squeeze out, we think, at least for the foreseeable future, all diesels to really improve the air quality in central London and also to stimulate further the ultra-low emission vehicle industries. Riots, do you want me to touch on riots?
Touch on riots, very quickly.
I would just say on the riots that I can't talk about Stockholm's riots because I know almost nothing about them except they're going on. But when it comes to London's riots, I think that what actually happened was in Tottenham there was a classic police riot following the shooting dead of a man. And then what happened was it was seen by some people that the police were not preventing the looting of other parts of London. So there was some looting in Wood Green, which is down the road from Tottenham. So over that weekend and the following Monday, it was felt by people that the police were not in control, so they went and, frankly, burgled and robbed and trashed the place. It wasn't, I don't believe, a kind of rage against the system in general. It was opportunistic, frankly. Now, the mayor's made some very interesting comments about where this comes from, and it's sort of he's described as lifting a paving stone and seeing the creepy crawlies and things. You know, so we got a big project in Tottenham which has been criminally left by successive governments. Not you know, there's big riots in the mid-80s, and then nothing's been done. So he's doing a huge regeneration project. Millions of pounds are going in there, working with Tottenham Hotspur to regenerate an area that frankly had been not addressed by generations of politicians. And you know, the current mayor and the current government are actually, and in fairness, the local authority as well, are stepping up to try and address a generational problem there. When it comes to the why did all these kids decide to go trash the place? Well, a lot of them have not been educated very well, and we need to address that challenge. And that is something the mayor has driven in the second term very much through my colleague Munir Mirza, and setting a real challenge for the education system within London. So, and then there's the apprenticeship scheme that we're doing, the rest of it. So that's the wider quality of life agenda that we're doing.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. We are, as ever, time poor. We've got 10 minutes, just under 10 minutes left of this session. Let me try and squeeze in 2 more questions, if I may. There's a lady there and a gentleman at the front here. And again, if you can keep your question fairly crisp, that would be great.
Good morning, my name is Rafael. I work for Nexus Carbon Development. Being based in Southeast Asia, I've got a different experience of urbanism, obviously, and I witness erratic development of Southeast Asian cities, such as Bangkok, Jakarta, Manila, with 20 million people. So I'd like to know what's the C40 initiative doing to support those latecomers. And second question, quickly for the entire panel. What do you think of the carbon neutral goals of Australian cities, Sydney, Melbourne, more lately the city of Yarra, that have carbon neutrality statutes by, same as London, taking measures, but also taking the debate one step further by offsetting their inevitable emissions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if we can bring the microphone down to Dax at the front here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dax Lovegrove, WWF. There's the potential for insurance companies to withdraw from high-risk areas due to the effects of climate change. And the insurance sector, I think, in this country is putting pressure on government to spend more on flood defences just when it's trying to obviously reel back on public spend. So where do you see that debate going? You know, are taxpayers going to increasingly foot the bill for the effects of climate change, or will it be the insurance sector? How do you break that sort of emerging standoff?
Okay, thank you. Okay, Terri, do you want to kick off with some thoughts from a C40 perspective on those emerging cities in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, no, definitely. So of those 3 cities that you mentioned, 2 of those are C40 cities, so Jakarta and Bangkok. Jakarta is actually on our steering committee and board along with Matthew from London. So they are very represented within the C40. In terms of what specifically we're doing in those cities, in Jakarta we've been working on a number of things, including working with them on developing a new building code for green buildings, which they also believe will really contribute to green growth and that their buildings will become more competitive. It will also encourage the procurement of new innovative technologies which may be able to be manufactured locally. So that was announced quite recently, and they're very excited about the potential there. We've also done quite a bit of work on waste management. It's a big issue in cities in the developing world, working on integrated waste management and improving collection rates as well as diversion of recycling and composting. But in both of those cities, we're actually doing a lot of work on adaptation. We have a few networks focused on adaptation. One of those is called Connecting Delta Cities. So those are cities that are in river deltas, essentially. It's a network led by the city of Rotterdam. And actually, we're bringing Jakarta, Bangkok, and about 18 other cities together in Rotterdam next week to discuss some of the approaches. And these cities have benefited from the guidance of cities like Rotterdam, which have a huge expertise in managing risk from rising water levels. And a lot of these cities like Jakarta and Bangkok are developing adaptation plans with the support of other cities within the network. So we're really excited about the progress in those cities. And that actually relates to the question about adaptation and insurance companies. And that is also something that we're working on. And I believe Matthew was in New York a couple of weeks ago at the launch of a new framework, a commitment that C40 has made to the Clinton Global Initiative. Bloomberg announced to President Clinton, former President Clinton, that the C40 will be developing a risk assessment framework, working closely with insurance companies to look at how cities evaluate risk, how they work with insurance companies to bring them on board and really have a common approach and language and methodology around risk and to work together. And so in the same event that we're having in Rotterdam next week, we do have some insurance companies that will be attending for one small session and really be speaking with all of the cities from around the world about some of the challenges that we are facing with climate change adaptation and the challenge of areas which may be more difficult to insure. And Matthew was there in New York, and I wasn't, so he may have more to add on that.
Thank you. I'll come back to Matthew in a moment. Gerhard, just wonder whether you have a perspective, particularly around the area of mobility in terms of the younger cities, Southeast Asia and elsewhere. Are they getting the message? Are they ahead of the ahead of the curve in terms of planning for much lower carbon mobility?
Well, I think what we observe is a very interesting development. On the one side, you see that the fastest expanding social group all around the world and also in urban cities is a middle class. And we see there's a middle class had on the one side one first wish to buy a car, that's good for us. But on the other side, so you have also a very strong development to be sensitive in environmental issues. And I think so important is to find the right balance between this. On the one side, I know it is important to organize a mobility system at a high level, to organize it because it's important for economic development, for growth and all these things on the one side. On the other side, I think, and this is, I think, a new development in the world we are facing now, that it is becoming very, very fast, that these groups also expect environment which is acceptable, and therefore I think all actors, all sectors are responsible to find the right solutions. But when we are discussing a plan for an urban area, for example, I think it's important that all sectors accept their own responsibility and bring in their technology competences and all the other things, but all in all, at the end of the day, financial resources are scarce, and therefore it's necessary to find what will be setting up the priority. And as far as I can see, for some of the mentioned mega cities, it is important to have early wins, so to speak, by more efficient buildings and more efficient energy systems than for mobility systems, because at the first stage, mobility systems are very impulsive, very momentum for economic development, and therefore it doesn't make sense to restrict them so much.
Thank you very much. We're almost out of time. Very last comment from Conor and Matthew.
Just very briefly to answer the question about offsetting in Australian cities, yes, I think Sydney in particular is quite big on offsetting its emissions from its municipal government operational emissions. At CDP, we don't allow cities to basically subtract that from their total emissions inventory, but we do allow them to report it separately. So, I think that's fine. Some cities are going to choose to do offsetting, but I think it's just important that they be very clear and transparent about where they're offsetting and how they're offsetting when they're reporting out their overall emissions inventory. And then, Dex, to your question about insurance companies, I just wanted to add to what Terri said. I think you're seeing two things. One, government's taking up the slack where insurance companies won't. I think you're seeing that across the board because the government wants to continue to encourage economic development, encourage people to build houses, all those things. And some of them are just in denial about what the consequences are going to be of that. And the second thing you're seeing in really leading places is that they're just banning development in low-lying places. And you're seeing this. The state of New York has a bill pending right now post-Hurricane Sandy to prevent redevelopment in certain specific low-lying areas in the state, which I think is fantastic. And one of the only real leadership places I've seen in this area to really take a very difficult politically stand on this issue. So,
thank you, Matthew.
I suppose the silver lining of the Hurricane Sandy event last year was that the richer Western countries finally woke up to the spectacular damage that more frequent storms like that can do. So, Bangkok had already been flooded. Jakarta was flooded frequently. There was a terrible heat wave in Moscow. Buenos Aires flooded. I mean, all these places have had extreme weather events that appear to be becoming more common. And in fact, in this event that Terri alluded to, that President Clinton and Mayor Bloomberg sort of got together sort of the chief people from a series of insurance companies and the World Bank and other such organizations to discuss this. And one of the amazing statistics that President Clinton mentioned was how much insurance claims had gone up in the last 20 years. Now, I forgot what the order of magnitude was, but it was a lot. And when you think about that, as President Clinton said, that is actually a lot less than the damage probably was, because a lot of these places weren't even insured. So it wakes up the more extreme weather events are happening, it's becoming a more serious problem. London is quite lucky with this. Our risk is relatively low. But that's not to say we aren't doing what we can to minimise the damage and make us more resilient when a huge rainstorm does hit us. This will hit us in due course because that's inevitable. When it comes to insurance in the UK, you're right, there appears to be a standoff at the moment between the government and the insurance companies. There is, I think, a request to extend the current deal. It's a difficult one because there's a moral hazard argument. And so there needs to be some kind of arrangement, I think, so that everybody can get insurance. But equally, you can't have the government stepping in at all times when, frankly, people should have insured themselves. So there is a difficult balance there that needs to be struck, and I hope that rational minds in government and insurance companies will do that. I think it's fair to say that some insurance companies are now waking up to this problem. They need to try and minimise their losses when a huge storm hits a place that is insured. And I think that the event 3 weeks ago in New York showed that they are waking up to this. One of C40's donors is an insurance company, so they are waking up to all this. And as all these things, don't be too pessimistic. And I think the spectacular damage that cost X billion dollars in New York in November or the end of October has actually woken up the richer West to what is a growing problem.
Thank you, Matthew. We are, of course, now out of time. We will try not to be too pessimistic. I will try not to be too pessimistic. I think inevitably in the hour we've only just taken a peek under the lid of Pandora's box. This is incredibly complex territory, but I think there is some room for optimism. And as Will said, we have to get it right at the city scale. Perhaps they do provide the unique sort of scale and the unique sort of framework within which, as we've seen, politicians can create the enabling framework within which business can be proactive, invest, innovate, and deliver some of the solutions we need. Thank you to all my panelists. Thank you for your questions. Thank you very much.